This episode is sponsored by Kendo UI. Kendo UI allows you to build better apps faster. They have a comprehensive library ranging from data grids and charts to buttons and sliders. Plus, you can use their components as plain JavaScript as well as in Angular, React, and Vue. They have a large collection of customizable popular themes like Bootstrap and Material. Go check them out at reactroundup.com/KendoUI.
Hello, welcome to another episode of React Roundup. I'm your host, Nader Dabit. Today, as our special guest, we have Paul Gray. Paul, welcome to the show.
Hi, good to be here.
So, Paul, this is the first time me and you have met, and I'm sure a lot of people that don't already know you would love to hear, kind of what you're doing. Can you give us a quick intro?
Sure. My name is Paul. I'm a software developer at an educational technology company called Learning Objects. We have a learning platform that helps instructional designers create better content.
So how long have you been working with React, and how did you kind of get into programming?
I've been working with React for, probably about 2 years. And originally I got into programming TI-89 calculators in middle school, and it was super fun. And I was like, I want to do this for the rest of my life. So went to school probably, 10 years ago. So I've been programming for around 10 years.
Okay, cool. So did you study programming, or did you kind of just get into it on your own?
Yeah, well, so when I was in high school, it was definitely on my own. And then I went to college in Virginia. I got a degree in software engineering, actually, oddly enough.
Oh, very cool.
Undergrad degree.
Oh, that's still awesome, though.
Yeah.
And it's funny that you mentioned TI-83 or the calculator stuff. You'd be surprised, I would say 25% of the people that I've interviewed have said the same thing. It's crazy. That must be just a gateway drug for a lot of people.
It was a TI-89 plus silver edition.
Oh, really? You still remember? Well, so today our topic is going to be a new library or utility that Paul has kind of created called Chainable Components. And we're going to talk about why it was created. We're going to touch on a few things that are kind of around render props and how order component discussion. We've had this discussion around that a couple of times on this show. Now we're going to kind of talk about a solution, and we're going to kind of talk about other solutions that are around the same space, and when you may want to use chainable components, when you may want to use order components, when you might want to use render props, when you might want to use context, when you would use certain solutions for certain problems. So can you talk about what Chainable Components is and why you made it?
Sure. So I was a big fan of higher order components as a pattern when it came out. And then I listened to the Michael Jackson gave a talk on, render props components, how it solved a lot of the problems that higher order components have. And it made a lot of sense to me, but the one thing I missed from higher order components was their composability. So I wanted to make something that had the declarativeness of the render props components, but didn't sacrifice anything on the composability side.
Right, because if you're using render props, you end up with nesting if you have multiple pieces of data you want to work with, right? Is that kind of the problem you're trying to solve?
Right, exactly. They're basically, it's really tough to compose them. It's definitely not as easy as composing higher order components where you just need a simple one-line function. So yeah.
So can you talk about the API for Chainable Components? I know it's kind of hard to talk about APIs on a podcast, but I guess more about some of the decisions you made and kind of if someone was using another library, what knowledge could they take to this library to kind of understand how to get going quickly?
Sure. So the easy way I explain it to people, which usually resonates with JavaScript developers, is if you think about what promises did for asynchronous callback methods, Chainable Components does something very similar for render props components. So if you think about way back in the day where we were doing asynchronous requests in Node.js. And we had to say we wanted to do 3 requests in a row where we request a user image, like a user profile. We get some JSON back, and then on that profile is the URL of the user. So we then go fetch that URL. So if we have 3 of these requests that we want to do in a row, where each sort of builds on the context of the previous one, it got very hairy very quickly. And a lot of people reference this as, the pyramid of doom problem, where the code just kind of leans into the right of the screen. So to sort of counteract that and make that API a little bit easier, people develop these things called promises, and basically helped a bit where it would wrap the context of the resource you're requesting in this encapsulated object that had handy methods on it that made it a lot easier to deal with. So the idea is you would, instead of providing a callback, you would just get an object back, which was called a promise. And then to get at the resource asynchronously, you would call the then method. And the then method was really powerful because it could you could return a promise and would automatically compose those 2 promises. So what does that have to do with Chainable Components? Well, so if you look at the anatomy of a render prop component, you have some configuration attributes. These are almost like parameters to the render prop component. And then you have another parameter, which is essentially a callback function, right? Which it takes the value that the render prop produces and passes it as a parameter to that function. So if you kind of tilt your head and squint, a render prop component has kind of a similar API to an asynchronous callback function from Node.js, right? You have the parameters, which are the attributes, and then you have the child function, which is the callback function. With render props, it's not always asynchronous, so it's a little bit different. But basically, we can develop the same or a similar API that promises add on top of asynchronous callback functions. We can do that for render props components, and that's basically what Chainable Components is.
So can you use Chainable Components with Async Await?
Good question. You can. So I've done a little bit of research, and in the TypeScript compiler, since I don't know if many of the runtimes support it, I've tried to use it with the TypeScript compiler, and it kind of converts it to a promise. So it doesn't actually work with Async Await. There's actually a really interesting GitHub gist that someone created, which was basically, you can Google it. It's called, what is it called? Async Await is the do notation of JavaScript. It's something like that. And it basically talks about how, Async Await composes promises. We can compose other things too. But in the end, we realized that it only works for promises, which is a little disappointing. But anyway, that's a really good question. So no, you can't use it with Async Await.
Okay, interesting. So what are some good use cases? I know that hardware components are used with Redux. They're used with libraries like Apollo. And then, render props. I know React Router implements those for routing and things like that. What are some good use cases if someone was going to kind of use this? Would this be something that someone would build a library with, or would this be something they'd be able to use in just a regular app?
Well, so I think it's just another tool to share reusable code in React. If we think historically, we started with kind of mix-ins as the de facto way, and mix-ins fell out of favor for a variety of reasons, which are probably for another podcast episode. Then we sort of built higher order components And then a lot of people have taken up render props. I think it's just another way to sort of have reusable code. I tend to prefer this API over higher order components or render props, but it's something that I've just started on, so we'll see.
Very cool, very cool. So when was this released as of today? Was it just like this week?
I've been working on it for the past couple months. I had to put it to the side because I was picking up another project, but it's been in the works for a couple months. It took me a while to get the initial implementation out because I had the idea in my head of adding a promise-like API on top of render props, but it took a while for me to actually understand under the hood. Initially, I wanted to build it for higher order components, but there's some limitations there, which I can get into later. So really, it works well with converting render props. So yeah, I could talk a little bit about the API if you'd like.
Yeah, let's talk about it.
Okay, so basically, a lot of these promise libraries have functions that convert asynchronous functions to functions that return promises. And so I've sort of built the same thing into this library with a build chainable function. And so what this function does is it takes a render prop component and converts it into a chainable component. And what that is basically it's a function that returns this object, which you could think of as kind of like a promise. Instead of having a .then, it has a .app, which is short for apply. And so apply is just taking the functionality that's encapsulated in that object and actually rendering it into a JSX element. So for instance, I have an example chainable component or render prop component called with state, which takes some initial state and adds some state modifiers for it. It's a handy little thing. It was actually inspired by the with state higher order component from Recompose. So what I do is I built a render prop component for with state and then I've converted it to a chainable component. So anyway, this chainable component is this function where you pass it in an initial state, returns this object that has methods on it, kind of like a promise. It has a .app method, which takes a function that takes the state object inside of it and returns a JSX element, which sort of renders that view for the state. So it's very similar to a render prop already with that API. So basically, you'd use this if you wanted to sort of keep a little counter, right? You use the with state chainable component, pass it in maybe 0 to start out with, and then there's methods encapsulated in there to like increment the state. But what's interesting about this object that you get back is you don't necessarily have to call this apply method right away. You can sort of hold on to the object for a little bit because there's other interesting methods that I've added onto this API. So there's one called map. So map, which sort of sounds like app with an M, is very similar to a map function that you would call on a list, whereas the map function operates on every single item in a list. The map function for the chainable component just operates on the contextual value inside of the chainable component. Yeah. So it's useful if you want to sort of modify a value. So an example of that would be, say I actually want to modify the initial counts to be, I don't know, start at 5 maybe rather than 0. If I already have a reference to that object, I can just call map and add 5 to that initial value. And so I get back a new chainable component which has the initial value plus 5. So map is kind of interesting. The other method that's also interesting is the .chain method. So that's a little bit more powerful than map. It's a lot similar to the that you find on promises. So chain is basically a function that takes another function, which takes as a parameter the contextual value from the chainable component and returns another chainable component. You can actually compose two different chainable components together. So whereas with a render prop, you actually have to create another function and get that deep nesting, like you said, you can call chain on a chainable component.
This episode is sponsored by DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean is the hosting provider I use for devchat.tv. I also use it for my applications that manage the RSS feeds, scheduling, and sponsorships involved in delivering these shows. DigitalOcean is easy to use, has data centers all over the world, and provides terrific services including server hosting and object storage for delivering your web applications and assets quickly and easily. I use DigitalOcean because I love their interface. I get SSD storage for my servers, and their support replies quickly. So go check them out at digitalocean.com.
It's much more simple to compose them that way. So it's tough to really kind of talk about this.
Yeah, totally. No, you're doing a great job. It's actually super interesting. I like, the first overall feeling I get after going through the documentation is it's like combining. Well, actually, I think you mentioned this. Maybe combining the best of both. Whereas we're pulling. Well, before I go into this, actually. Does this use is there any way to use context? Does this use context kind of under the hood, or is this something like that? It's all local. The data is all local to where this is being created. Just out of curiosity.
So it doesn't use context at all. It's really just an API on top of render props. So if you look at the source, if you look at the chainable component file, it's about not even 50 lines.
Gotcha. Yeah, so what I was going to say is this brings the best of render props, along with hardware components. And I could see where this would actually come in handy for certain use cases I'm already thinking about. But for certain things that render props to me just don't work right now, people are trying to fit, render props into everything because it's the cool thing to do. I think hardware components still have their place, render props, have their place with certain things, but my problem with render props now, they're great for certain use cases, like I mentioned, but you do get that nasty nested combination of a lot of JavaScript with your UI code, and anything more than nesting 2 levels deep to me is just I wouldn't say it's unreadable or unusable, but it's not good looking code.
Yeah. So another problem that higher order components had was if you had 2 higher order components that you wanted to compose, and the output of one higher order component needed to get used as input to the next higher order component, that would just be a huge pain because you'd often have to have an intermediary higher order component to sort of map the output of the previous one as parameters to the next one. And so if we sort of bundle that up in an asynchronous API, that's something that render props solved. And so this chain method on the chainable components, actually, it's just a function kind of like render props where you just have access to the outer context because it's just a parameter to the function.
Right. Very cool. So how long, this is a question not really around the library itself, but for people that are looking to build something open source, how long have you been building and contributing to open source? That's my first question. And how did you get into it? I guess goes along with that. And then second, how long did it take you to build this library? I know you mentioned you started on it and you kind of stopped, but say you were going to stay building this nonstop. I'm just kind of curious how long it would take to build something like this.
So I've been doing open source since I've been doing professional software. I don't know why. I like the idea of collaborating with people. So one of the goals that I have for myself, at least, is to really make education a lot more affordable. My skills as a software developer, I think I can best contribute to that goal by creating open source software that maybe educational technology companies use, maybe other companies use. So that's really why I enjoy doing open source work. As far as this library, it took me, so it's definitely not in a state where it's production ready. I still have a lot of cleanup to do, a lot of documentation to write, so on and so forth. But for the first while, it probably took me, I don't know, about a month to get an implementation that I was really happy with. It was kind of like, I just kind of was playing around one day thinking of trying to come up with, because I knew it theoretically should be possible. It normally wouldn't take me that long to actually write, 50 lines of code. But it was a really complicated problem to try and solve, in a way that was easy to use. So yeah, about a month.
That's cool. No, it's definitely not an easy problem to solve because hasn't really been solved yet. So it's, I mean, we have solutions that work, but I wouldn't say any of them are like ideal. Or maybe we're just spoiled in the React community because things are so good. There's always innovation happening, and this definitely, serves a purpose. Well, when you mentioned that it's not production ready, are you saying that if someone used this, like they might run into bugs, or is it not production ready in the sense that it doesn't have all the documentation and you want to continue to add features before like a version like 1 release?
Yeah, I definitely love to get more documentation out there. Again, it is 50 lines of code, so the surface area for bugs to pop up is very small at the moment.
That's good.
I'd love to also build out some more components, or chainable components, sort of similar to how Recompose has a bunch of utilities for higher order components and also a lot of very useful higher order components. I'd like to build a lot of useful chainable components.
Very cool. So if someone wants to not only start this repo, but also kind of like follow along with you, where are you on social media, like Twitter? Do you write or anything like that? Do you have a website?
Yeah, my domain name is paulgray.net. It's not paulgray.com. That domain is owned by someone who posts nice pictures of cats. So that's my domain. I have a blog there. I'm on Twitter. You can. My handle is Paul Grizay. It's PaulGrizzay. That's about all I check.
Cool. Well, we'll go ahead and jump to the picks. But before we do that, is there anything else you wanted to kind of go over that we haven't discussed yet?
I can go into a little bit more depth on the relationship it kind of has with promises and lists. I don't know if you'd like me to.
Yeah, totally. That'd be interesting.
Okay. I might use the M word, if you're familiar.
I don't. What word is that?
Bonehead.
Oh yeah, go for it, dude.
Okay. So you may have picked up on the fact on this pattern and recognized it. So what it's called in functional programming, it actually pops up a lot. So it's called a monad. And actually, I'm sure you've heard the term that promises are monads. Well, chainable components also are monads. You don't have to understand that term to be able to reap the benefits of using monads. I just feel it's fun to talk stuff. So what does that actually buy us? Well, there's lots of methods that can be applied generally to monads. One of them is the all method. So if you're familiar with, have you ever used the promise.all method?
Right. Yes.
Where you have a list of promises and it just combines or composes them into one promise. So we can build that same exact method for chainable components. So if you think about promise.all takes a list of promises and it turns it into a promise of lists. Or sorry, a promise of list, right? So it kind of just flips it. So it takes a promise of list, turns it into a list of promises. Sorry, the opposite way.
A list of promises turns into a promise
Yes.
of list.
Of list. Yes, exactly. So if we have a list of chainable components, we can turn that easily into a chainable component of lists. And you can actually do that for all monads. There's a maybe monad that a lot of people might be familiar with. So if you have a list of maybe monads, you can change that into a maybe of list monads, whereas there's only a list if they're all present. That kind of makes sense.
So what language is can you do this in the maybe stuff? I mean, it's not JavaScript, is it?
So there's maybe implementations that are for JavaScript. When you get into the more complicated functional stuff, it's often useful to have types. But yeah, there's maybe libraries that exist for JavaScript. Some are in TypeScript. Some probably for Flow. As a full stack developer at work, we use a language called Scala on the back end, which is a typed functional language. It uses monads quite frequently. So it's actually a pattern that pops up quite often in languages, and it's sort of finding its way into JavaScript. Another example is the async that you mentioned. So Async Await is really neat, and it basically provides a composable interface for promises. So if you think about promises, they didn't really solve the pyramid of doom problem fully, because if you want to build a request that uses the output of a previous promise in the chain, then you have to nest that, right? There's no way to you can kind of hack it by returning an array of values and then unwrapping that array in the next, but that's very complicated. In a lot of these other functional languages, they have syntax sugar for composing these things that are called monads. And so if you go read through that blog post that guy wrote about how async await is the do notation, that's essentially what he's talking about. Is async await is a way to compose and using syntax that's very similar to how other functional languages provide sugar for composing monads. And so async await kind of really excites me on the one hand, whereas it disappoints me a little bit because they could have just made it slightly more generic and have had it work for all types of monads, which would have been great. But here we are,
That's interesting to hear. Do you think it's something that could be adjusted in the spec, or is it kind of a decision that you don't think that can be fixed? Because I've never actually looked at anything as far as the implementation goes of that, of async await, or even how I would.
I think async await it's too late on that bus, just because even the terminology is really specific to asynchronous, like async and await. A lot of these other languages have more generic language like do and yield. It's funny, someone sort of threw in as a comment to that blog post, someone threw in an implementation of this using generators. which I found really interesting, but TypeScript was just not there yet. Last time I looked at it, it really the types fully correctly. So I think that a lot of these functional concepts are really ripe for the picking. And I've already seen a few TC39 proposals around sort of like binding functions together. I think it would be not a bad idea to add sugar for monads too.
Cool. That would be interesting. I know that functional programming is coming more and more into JavaScript. We're seeing it become mainstream. I don't know a lot about functional programming other than what I've learned in the JavaScript world. But, the people that are functional programmers seem to be pretty adamant about it. Like it's a good paradigm. So anything that we can learn from other people that are doing good stuff is always really good for the JavaScript community. Is there any other, like, if someone wants to learn about functional programming, like, is there a certain reference or language or just anything that you would kind of encourage them to check out?
So actually, I read this really great book called Functional Programming in Scala. So it's not for JavaScript, obviously, but it's very good. It's very approachable. It's a very good read. And it actually goes into these very complicated concepts. So it approaches programming very pragmatically, and it always sort of relates it to real world problems. Examples are in Scala, but I think that's a really good thing. Scala is a strongly typed language, and I think it's a good idea to sort of kind of explore and play with typed languages if you only have a dynamically typed language like JavaScript. But that book is very good on a lot of more complicated functional concepts like monads and functors.
Very cool. Well, is there anything else you wanted to touch on before we wrap it up?
No, I think we're good.
Okay, awesome. Well, I guess since we're done, we'll get to the picks. Do you have any picks today?
Do you run your own freelance business? Or maybe you're thinking about picking up some business on the side? Well, then you need FreshBooks. FreshBooks is the quickest and easiest way to get invoices out to your clients. It's easy to use. It works anywhere, available from any device, on the desktop, iPhone, iPad, Android, and all of your data is backed up and secure. And it makes it really easy to get organized and get paid. You'll be tracking time, logging expenses, and invoicing your clients in no time. You can also save time billing, freeing up several days per month to focus on the work that you love, and you get paid faster. FreshBooks customers are paid on average 5 days faster because there's a link on the invoice that says pay me now. And it's a great way to grow your business. Plus, FreshBooks is offering a 30-day trial. That's right, 30-day trial if you try them out. So go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. Once again, for a 30-day trial, go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section.
Sure. So my wife and I just bought a house, and we're trying to furnish it. So we've been watching a bunch of interior design shows. The Great Interior Design Challenge is on Netflix. It was a really fun one. And we also we have some demolitions planned for our new home. Another one is Little Tykes, Red Cars. Those cars you've always played with as a young kid. My son just turned 1, and we got him one for his birthday, and he's been loving it so far.
What city do you live in?
I live in Maryland. The Learning Objects office is in DC, so I make the commute every day. It's a lot of fun.
Okay, cool. Well, awesome. So I have a couple of picks. The first one is Vero React, which is the React Native VR and AR library. They added a new feature for image triggers into their library a few weeks ago. So what that basically does is you can basically set a an image or a piece of UI that you want to reference, like a PNG or whatever, or even any type of I think it's any type of image, and you can basically set it as a trigger, and you can kind of set your functions based around whether or not that trigger is recognized. So what that basically means is you can do cool stuff like when your VR app is open, or when your AR app is open. Actually, it's more like an AR thing. And you're scanning and you're looking around, you can do interactive stuff. So one example is there was an example with the Tesla logo. When the Tesla logo like shows up, a car pops up, and then it has like this this menu where you can like change the colors and the car spinning around. Another one was the Black Panther, where when they see the Black Panther logo, the Black Panther actually jumps out of wherever that image is and like comes into real life. It's really cool. So Vero React in general is a cool library, but they added something that makes it like 10 times better, in my opinion. This is just, it's really, really interesting, and it's super easy to implement. My second pick is the Expo blog, and we've talked about Expo. Well, I have actually on my podcast so many times. But Expo is a React Native framework, and they have an excellent blog. And if you've ever wanted to learn about building mobile apps with React Native or with React, then check out their blog. They have a lot of good stuff on there. Okay, well, Paul, thanks for coming on the show today. We appreciate your time, and look forward to seeing more of your work in the future.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah, totally. Thanks, everyone, for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com.